He didn't go there for the tennis. Let that sink in for a second. Roberto Benigni, the man who made the entire world weep with a single film, who stood on an Oscar stage and literally climbed over seats because he was too overwhelmed with joy to walk normally, who has spent 50 years capturing the most profound moments of human existence on camera. This man drove to a tennis stadium in Rome not to watch a match, but to find a 20-year-old girl from Manila who had already lost. And what he said to her when he finally found her, sitting alone in a medical room with her ankle wrapped and her eyes red, has since been watched over 20 million times. But here's what nobody is talking about. Nobody is asking why a filmmaker of his caliber, a man who doesn't do celebrity appearances, who doesn't chase viral moments, felt so compelled by this specific story that he picked up the phone and called tournament organizers personally. That question matters more than anything else. And by the time we get to the answer, I promise you it will hit differently than you expect. So let's go back. Not to the medical room, not to the meeting, but to the moment this whole thing actually began, because it didn't start in Rome, and it didn't start with tennis. It started with a video on a phone screen at midnight. Benigni was scrolling, the way we all do, half present, half asleep, when something stopped him cold. Not a highlight reel, not a championship moment. What stopped him was footage of a young woman limping, visibly, painfully limping, on a clay court in Rome against the second-best tennis player in the entire world. Her ankle was taped. Her movement was compromised. Any rational person watching that match would have thought the same thing. This is over. She just doesn't know it yet. But Alex Eala didn't quit. And the crowd, the absolute thunderstorm of a crowd that had packed the Foro Italico, wasn't cheering for her to win. They were cheering for her to keep going. And that distinction, that specific, unusual kind of energy in that stadium, is what made Benigni put his phone down, sit up straight, and watch again from the beginning, because he recognized something he had spent his entire career trying to recreate on screen. He just didn't expect to find it at a tennis tournament in his own city. Here's what you need to understand about Alex Eala before we go any further. Because if you think this story is just about a feel-good sports moment, you're watching the wrong video. Alex Eala is 20 years old. She's from the Philippines. And she had done something in Rome that week that had never been done before. She had turned an Italian tennis stadium into a sea of Philippine flags. Not dozens of flags, thousands. Filipinos who had flown in from across Europe, who had driven through the night from different countries, who had taken days off work they couldn't afford to miss, all gathered in Rome to watch one of their own compete on the world stage. The chant, "Laban Alex, fight Alex," echoed through the Foro Italico like a pulse, like something alive. Italian fans who had never heard a Filipino crowd before stood still and just listened, visibly moved by something they couldn't quite name. And that's the thing about what Eala had created in Rome. It wasn't just a tennis atmosphere. It was something older than sport. It was a diaspora finding its voice in the most unexpected place imaginable, then it was taken away. Right when it should have peaked, right when the story seemed to be building towards something, the ankle gave out. Grade 2 sprain against Elena Rybakina, world number 2, clay court specialist, one of the most technically brutal players on tour. Eala had been pushing her, had broken her serve, had dragged 32 unforced errors out of a player who almost never cracks. The crowd was losing its mind. And then, mid-rally, something shifted. If you watch the footage carefully, you can see the exact moment she knows something is wrong. The way she pulls up, the way she glances down at her foot before she even glances at the score. And yet she doesn't stop. She goes back to the baseline. She bounces on her good ankle. She serves again. She fights for 3 more games on a foot that should have ended her tournament an hour earlier. Why? That's the question nobody on the broadcast answered. Why does a 20-year-old, already knowing the match is slipping, already feeling the kind of pain that makes rational thought very difficult, choose to keep playing? The answer to that question is the same answer that made Roberto Benigni pick up his phone the next morning and call the tournament organizers. And we're getting there. But first, I need you to understand what happens in a Filipina's heart when she looks into those stands and sees those flags. The Philippines is a country where sports heroes aren't just athletes. They're proof. They're evidence against a specific kind of quiet despair that comes from being told, generation after generation, that your people are best suited to work in other people's countries, clean other people's homes, raise other people's children. There are over 10 million Filipinos working abroad right now, 10 million people who sent money home this month, who video called their families across a 12-hour time difference, who carry a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't have a clean word in English. And when Alex Eala walked onto that clay court in Rome and the flags went up, those 10 million people, or at least the fraction of them who were watching, felt something crack open inside their chests. Not because she was going to win the Italian Open, nobody seriously expected that, but because she was there, because she belonged there, because for 1 week in Rome, one of their own was standing on the same court as the best players in the world and refusing to look small. That is what Eala was protecting when she limped back to that baseline. Not a ranking, not a trophy, something infinitely more fragile and infinitely more important. Now we're back to Benigni, and this is where the story takes a turn that I genuinely did not see coming when I first started researching this. Roberto Benigni is 73 years old. He has lived a life so full of emotion that most people couldn't sustain it for a decade, let alone 7. His career is essentially a study in how human beings hold on to hope when reality is telling them to let go. Life is Beautiful, the film that made him a global icon, is set in a Nazi concentration camp. The central character is a man who watches his world collapse and decides consciously, deliberately, to protect his young son from the truth by turning the Holocaust into a game, by making horror beautiful, by insisting, against every rational instinct, that there is still something worth fighting for. The film won 3 Academy Awards. It was criticized in some quarters for being too optimistic about something that should never be made optimistic, and defended in others as the most honest thing ever put on film about the human will to survive. Benigni himself has said that the film is not about the Holocaust. It's about a father, about love, about the specific kind of courage it takes to choose beauty when ugliness is all around you. So when this man, at 73, scrolls through his phone at midnight and sees a 20-year-old woman limping on a clay court, waving to a crowd of her people with tears threatening the edges of her eyes, refusing to give them the image of defeat, what does he see? He sees Guido. He sees his own protagonist. He sees the thing he spent his entire career trying to make audiences believe was real. And it's real. It's happening right now, in his own city, on a tennis court of all places. And that is why he called the organizers, not for a photo opportunity, not for a social media moment, because he needed to tell her that he had seen it, that it was real, that it mattered in a way that had nothing to do with rankings or trophies or whether she made it to the French Open. Here's how the meeting actually happened, and the details matter here because they reveal something about Benigni's character. That gets lost in the headline version of this story. He arrived at the Foro Italico quietly. No announcement, no press. He found a seat in the stands not in the celebrity section, not in the royal box, but in the regular seating where the fans were. He watched Ribachina dismantle the remnants of the match. He watched Eala finally withdraw. He watched the Philippine flags get slowly folded, and then he waited. When the tournament official knocked on the medical room door, Eala was sitting, alone, ankle-wrapped, processing the specific silence that follows a loss you knew was coming but couldn't prevent. She was not expecting anyone. She was certainly not expecting this. The official said there was someone who wanted to meet her. She assumed it was a journalist. She almost said no. The moment she walked into that small room near the royal box and saw a 73-year-old Italian man rise to his feet when she entered, stand up, out of respect for her, something shifted. She said later that she didn't know why, but she started crying before he even spoke. What he said in that room has been parsed and quoted and translated across dozens of languages in the weeks since. But I want to slow down here, because the words themselves are only half of what made this moment what it was. Benigni spoke softly. He didn't perform. He wasn't giving a speech. He was talking to a young woman who needed to hear something true. He told her that he had spent 50 years trying to capture beauty in film, and that he had never, not once, seen anything as beautiful as what she had done on that court. He told her that she reminded him of his own protagonist. Not because she was losing, but because she refused to let the people she loved see her. She loved see her give up. He told her that the flags, the chants, the sea of Filipino faces in that stadium, that was her gift to them, not winning. The gift was the refusal, the stubborn, luminous refusal to collapse. Then he reached into his pocket. And this is the detail that makes the whole thing feel cinematic in the most unscripted way possible. He pulled out a photograph, a physical photograph, a still from Life is Beautiful, showing Guido and his son riding a bicycle through a misty Roman street. He handed it to her. He said this was his most famous image. Then he said that now, when he thinks of that film, he will think of her too. Of a young woman limping on an ankle that had no business carrying her, waving to a crowd of people who needed her to keep going. He said, "Keep fighting. The world needs more fighters. The world needs more beauty." And then he left. The video of their meeting hit 20 million views in under 48 hours. But here's what I find more interesting than the numbers. Read the comments. Not the top comments. Scroll down into the ones that take a little longer to find. There are nurses from the Philippines writing about watching the match on their lunch breaks between shifts in London hospitals. There are construction workers in Qatar describing how they gathered around someone's phone during their break to watch Eala play. There are people from 40 different countries writing variations of the same sentence. I don't usually care about tennis, but I couldn't stop watching. That sentence is the whole story. It's the reason Benigni drove to the Foro Italico. It's the reason 20 million people watched a video about a match that the main character lost. Sport at its highest does this occasionally. It accidentally becomes about something larger than itself. And when it does, it reaches people that nothing else can reach. Eala didn't just compete at the Italian Open. She created a container for a feeling that millions of people had been carrying without knowing how to express it. And Benigni, who has spent his entire career building those containers out of light and shadow and celluloid, recognized it immediately. There is one more piece of this story that I haven't told you yet, and it's the piece that, for me, changes the entire texture of everything that came before it. A few days after the meeting, Benigni gave a brief interview about his visit to the Foro Italico. He was asked what he would remember most about the experience. The journalist expected him to talk about the meeting, about Eala, about the viral moment. Instead, Benigni went quiet for a few seconds. And anyone who knows his work knows that his silences are as intentional as his words. And then he said this: "I went there to recognize her courage. I did not expect her to remind me of mine." He didn't elaborate. He moved on to another question. But that line has stayed with me since I first heard it, because it suggests something that the headline version of this story completely misses. Benigni is 73. He has been one of the most celebrated filmmakers in the world for decades. And somewhere in watching a 20-year-old Filipino tennis player refuse to quit on a clay court in his home city, something in him was rekindled. Something that age and acclaim and the weight of a legendary career can quietly extinguish without you even noticing. She gave him something too. And he was honest enough to admit it. That is what great athletes do at their best. Not win, connect. Create these unexpected bridges between themselves and people who have nothing to do with their sport, who will never pick up a racket, who couldn't name 3 tennis players if you ask them, but who watch Alex Eala limp back to that baseline and feel something tighten in their chest because they have been there. Not on a clay court, in a hospital room, or a boardroom, or a kitchen, or anywhere that life has asked more of you than you thought you had left. And you gave it anyway. Not because you were sure you'd win, but because the people watching needed you to try. Eala will recover. Her ankle will heal. The French Open came too soon, and that hurts in the specific way that momentum interrupted. Always hurts. But she will be back on tour. She will walk onto another clay court somewhere, and the flags will go up again, and the chant will start again, and somewhere in Rome, a 73-year-old filmmaker will probably hear about it and smile in a way that only makes sense if you were in that small room near the royal box and you saw what passed between them. Not a celebrity and a fan, not a legend and a young player. 2 artists who recognized in each other the same essential thing: the belief, irrational and necessary and completely human, that beauty is worth fighting for even when you're losing. Especially when you're losing. Roberto Benigni said she reminded him of Life is Beautiful. But the truth, if you sit with this story long enough, is simpler and stranger than that. She didn't remind him of his film. She reminded him of why he made it.